Blood soaked through the shallow waters of Mactan Island as Ferdinand Magellan collapsed into the surf, his body pierced by bamboo spears and poison arrows. It was April 27th, 1521, and the man who had sailed farther than any European before him would never complete his journey. But here's the twist that history rarely tells you. Magellan wasn't actually the first person to circumnavigate the globe. That honour belongs to his slave, a man whose name was Enrique, and whose story is far stranger than you might imagine. The slave who conquered the world. Let's rewind to 1511, 10 years before Magellan's death. In the smoking ruins of Malacca, a Portuguese fortress in modern-day Malaysia, a young enslaved man from Sumatra was purchased by Ferdinand Magellan. His name was Enrique, and he would become the key to unlocking one of history's greatest mysteries. When Magellan bought him, Enrique had already travelled thousands of miles from his birthplace. What nobody realised at the time was that this purchase would create the first human being to actually complete a journey around the entire world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a slave became the first circumnavigator, we need to understand the man who owned him and the impossible dream that drove them both to the edge of the world. The man who refused to quit. Ferdinand Magellan wasn't supposed to be a hero. Born into minor Portuguese nobility around 1480, he spent his early career as a nobody, fighting in forgotten colonial wars in India and Morocco. He walked with a limp from a battle wound that never properly healed. The Portuguese king, Manuel I, despised him. When Magellan proposed an expedition to find a western route to the Spice Islands, the king laughed in his face. "You want to sail west to reach the east?" the king scoffed. "Columbus already tried that and found nothing but savages and empty land." But Magellan had a secret. He had studied maps and charts that others dismissed as fantasy. He believed with absolute certainty that there was a passage through or around the Americas that would lead to the Pacific Ocean. More importantly, he believed the Spice Islands, the source of the world's most valuable commodities, actually belonged on the Spanish side of the Treaty of Tordesillas, the agreement that had divided the unknown world between Spain and Portugal. In 1517, Magellan did something unthinkable for a Portuguese nobleman. He renounced his citizenship and offered his services to Spain. King Charles III of Spain, young and ambitious, saw an opportunity. If Magellan could find a western route to the Spice Islands and prove they belonged to Spain, the economic implications would be staggering. A single ship returning with spices could make investors 10 times their money. 5 ships and 270 dreams. On September 20th, 1519, 5 ships departed from Seville: the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria and Santiago. They carried 270 men from 9 different nations: Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, French, Germans, Greeks, Flemish, and 1 lone Englishman. It was a powder keg of competing loyalties, languages, and ambitions. And then there was Enrique. While the crew manifests listed him simply as Magellan's slave interpreter, he was about to become the most important member of the expedition. Having travelled from Southeast Asia to Europe with Magellan, he was already halfway around the world. If he could return to his homeland by continuing west, he would complete a full circuit of the globe. The voyage began badly and got worse. The Spanish captains, humiliated at serving under a Portuguese commander, plotted mutiny before they even left European waters. Magellan had to sleep with a loaded crossbow by his side. As they sailed down the African coast toward South America, tensions mounted. 3 of the 5 ship captains were actively planning to kill him. The edge of mutiny. By the time they reached South America and began searching for the passage through the continent, winter was approaching. In March 1520, Magellan ordered the fleet to anchor in a desolate bay he named Port St. Julian, in what is now Argentina. The men were freezing, starving, and furious. This wasn't what they had signed up for. On Easter Sunday, the mutiny exploded. 3 ships raised the flag of rebellion. the mutineers sent a boat to the Trinidad with an ultimatum: turn back or die. Magellan's response was pure genius. He sent a small boat to one of the rebel ships, the Victoria, as if to negotiate. Hidden inside were armed loyalists. When they boarded, they immediately killed the rebel captain and seized control of the ship. With superior numbers restored, Magellan ruthlessly crushed the rebellion. The punishment was medieval in its brutality. The mutiny's leader, Gaspar de Quesada, was beheaded and quartered, his body parts displayed as a warning. Another captain was marooned on the barren coast, with a priest who had supported the mutiny. They were given a little food and left to die. No European expedition had ever reached this far south and returned. Magellan was making it clear that there would be no turning back. The passage at the end of the world. For months they searched the South American coast, exploring every inlet and bay, hoping to find the passage that would connect the Atlantic to the unknown ocean beyond. They lost the Santiago to a storm. The crew was near mutiny again, and then, on October 21st, 1520, they found it. The passage was nothing like they had imagined. Instead of a simple strait, it was a maze of channels threading between mountains and glaciers. Strange fires burned on the southern shore at night, fires lit by indigenous people that gave this land its name, Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. The passage twisted and turned for 373 miles, taking 38 days to navigate. During the journey, the San Antonio, the largest ship with most of the supplies, deserted and sailed back to Spain. When they finally emerged into calm waters on November 28, 1520, Magellan supposedly wept. Ahead lay an ocean that Europeans had barely glimpsed. He named it Pacific, peaceful, because after the storms of the strait it seemed so calm. He had no idea that this peaceful ocean was actually the largest body of water on Earth, covering nearly a third of the planet's surface. The ocean of starvation. What happened next was the most brutal stretch of exploration in human history. Magellan believed the Spice Islands were perhaps a few weeks' sail across the Pacific. He was catastrophically wrong. The Pacific is nearly 10,000 miles wide at its greatest extent. The three remaining ships, Trinidad, Concepcion and Victoria, sailed for 99 days without seeing land except for two tiny, uninhabited atolls that offered no food or water. The crew began to die. First from scurvy, a disease that causes your gums to rot, your teeth to fall out, and old wounds to reopen. Then from starvation. They ate the leather wrapping on the masts, boiling it for 4 days to make it soft enough to chew. They ate sawdust. They ate rats, which sold for half a ducat each, a small fortune. They ate the ox-hide shields, which Antonio Pigafetta, the expedition's chronicler, described as being mostly maggots and worms. Men would lie on the deck too weak to move, their bodies covered in suppurating sores begging for death. 19 sailors died during the Pacific crossing. The survivors were walking skeletons, their eyes hollow and wild. When they finally spotted land on March 6, 1521, the island of Guam, the crew was so desperate that they stole everything they could from the native islanders, including the islanders' boats. Magellan named the place Islands of Thieves, apparently without irony. The translation that changed everything. After recovering in Guam, the expedition sailed to the Philippines, and here Enrique's story becomes central to history. When they arrived at the island of Limasawa on March 28, 1521, Magellan sent Enrique ashore to attempt communication with the locals. What happened next must have been an extraordinary moment. Enrique spoke to the islanders in Malay, and they understood him. After sailing 3/4 of the way around the world, travelling through storms and starvation, crossing 2 oceans and threading through an impossible strait, Magellan's slave was back in a region where his native language was spoken. For Enrique, this meant something profound. He had travelled west from the Malay archipelago to Portugal, then west again from Spain to the Philippines. He had circumnavigated the globe. Magellan didn't fully appreciate the significance of this moment. He was focused on converting the local rulers to Christianity and establishing Spanish dominance. Through Enrique's translations, Magellan befriended Raja Humabon of Cebu and convinced him to convert to Christianity along with hundreds of his subjects. But there was a problem. A nearby chief named Lapu-Lapu refused to acknowledge Spanish authority or convert to Christianity. Magellan, drunk on his recent successes and convinced of European military superiority, decided to teach Lapu-Lapu a lesson. The battle that killed a dream. On April 27, 1521, Magellan led 60 men in full armour to the shore of Mactan Island to fight Lapu-Lapu's forces. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Spaniards had to wade through shallow water to reach the beach, making their armour a liability rather than an asset. Lapu-Lapu had positioned over 1,200 warriors, and they had poison arrows that could penetrate the gaps in European armour. The battle was a massacre. Magellan's men tried to retreat, but the captain refused to leave. He stayed on the beach, fighting desperately as his men fled to the boats. A bamboo spear struck his leg, a poison arrow hit his shoulder. He fell face first into the water. The warriors swarmed over him with spears and knives. Ferdinand Magellan, the man who had sailed farther than any European before him, died in 3 feet of water, thousands of miles from home, killed by people defending their island from foreign invaders. He was approximately 41 years old. The slave's choice. After Magellan's death, Enrique faced a choice that would change history. Under the terms of Magellan's will, Enrique was supposed to be freed and given 10,000 maravedis. But the new expedition leaders, Juan Cerro and Duarte Barbosa, refused to honour these terms. They told Enrique he was still a slave and would remain one. This was a fatal mistake. Enrique, now the only person who could communicate effectively with the Filipinos, went to Raja Humabon and told him that the Spanish were planning to attack him. Whether this was true or a revenge plot by Enrique, we'll never know, but Humabon believed him. He invited the Spanish leaders to a feast and massacred them. 27 more Europeans died. The survivors fled in chaos, abandoning the Concepcion because they no longer had enough men to crew 3 ships. And Enrique? He simply disappeared from history. Some accounts say he stayed in Cebu, others claim he returned to his homeland in Sumatra. But think about what this meant. Enrique had travelled from Southeast Asia to Europe with Magellan, then from Europe west across the Atlantic, through the Strait of Magellan, across the Pacific, and back to Southeast Asia. He had circled the globe. Ferdinand Magellan never completed the journey, but his slave did. The journey home. Only 115 men remained to crew the Trinidad and Victoria. They finally reached the Spice Islands, the actual goal of the expedition, on November 8, 1521. They loaded the ships with cloves, nutmeg and mace worth a fortune. But the Trinidad was in terrible condition and stayed behind for repairs. It was later captured by the Portuguese. The Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, began the long journey home. Rather than face the Pacific again, Elcano decided to return via the Indian Ocean, sailing west around Africa. This meant travelling through waters controlled by Portugal, Spain's rival. They had to sneak past Portuguese fortresses, avoiding capture at all costs. The journey became another nightmare of starvation and disease. They threw the bodies of dead crewmen overboard almost daily. They stopped at islands only to find the Portuguese already there, forcing them to flee. When they finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope on May 6, 1522, only 47 men were still alive. On September 6, 1522, the Victoria limped into Seville harbour. 3 years had passed since the expedition departed. Of the original 270 men and 5 ships, only 18 Europeans and 1 ship survived to complete the circumnavigation. They were skeletal, sick, and half mad. But they had done it. They had sailed completely around the world. The legacy. The cargo of spices they brought back was valuable enough to cover the entire cost of the expedition and generate a profit. But the real treasure was knowledge. They had proved that the Earth could be circumnavigated by sea. They had demonstrated that the Pacific Ocean existed and was enormous. They had shown that the Americas were not part of Asia, but a separate continent blocking the route to the Spice Islands. Elcano became a hero in Spain, receiving a coat of arms featuring a globe with the Latin inscription Primus circumdedisti me. You first encircled me. But he wasn't first. That honour likely belongs to Enrique, the enslaved man whose name appears only briefly in the expedition records, but whose journey was truly complete. As for Magellan himself, he never gets the credit he deserves because he never completed the voyage. But without his vision, determination, and refusal to turn back despite mutinies, starvation, and impossible odds, the first circumnavigation would never have happened. He found the passage that connected the world's oceans. He crossed the largest ocean on Earth. He proved that the globe could be circled. The strait he discovered still bears his name, the Strait of Magellan, and every time we look at a map and see how the continents fit together, how the oceans connect, how truly round our world is, we're seeing the world that Ferdinand Magellan and his crew, including one enslaved translator who became the first true circumnavigator, reveal to us. Their journey changed everything. It showed that the Earth was far larger than anyone had imagined. It connected civilizations that had never known each other existed. It began the age of global trade, global empire, and ultimately the globally connected world we live in today. All because one limping Portuguese captain refused to give up on an impossible dream, and all because his slave, Enrique, spoke the right languages at the right time. The first circumnavigation of the globe wasn't a triumph. It was a horror story of mutiny, starvation, disease, and death. Out of 270 men, only 18 returned. But those 18 proved that our world was one world connected by water, navigable from any point back to itself. They showed us that the Earth was truly round, not in theory, but in practice. And somewhere in the Philippines, an enslaved man named Enrique became the first person to prove it with his own journey, even though history barely remembers his name.